Hello everyone. I hope you all are having an amazing evening / afternoon depending on where you are. My name is Katarina Hodge and I am the Member Services Assistant for the TNCP, which means I took webinars off of Gwen's hands to her complete relief. So if you hear jingling in the background, forewarning, you are not hallucinating. It is just my cat running around in my apartment. He's unhappy that I am doing a webinar right now. So anyways, a few things before I introduce Dr. Curdt. Please make sure to type any questions into the chat box and send it my way. At the end of her presentation, I will ask her the questions that you send me. Also, make sure your microphones are on mute so there will be no outside disturbances. Without further ado, let's learn a little bit more about Dr. Curdt. Dr. Allison Curdt is a PGA Master Professional in Instruction and an LPGA Class A member. Being one of 11 women to achieve the highest PGA credential earned by an instructor, Dr. Curdt has over 28 years of golf competition background and has recently played in 5 LPGA Tour Majors and competed in the 2018 PGA Professional Championship. Dr. Curdt arrived to California after being a 2-time academic All-American and competing on a full scholarship on the women's golf team at Florida State University. Owner of Allison Curdt Golf in Simi Valley, California, she earned the 2016 Southern California PGA Teacher of the Year, 2016 SCPGA Northern Chapter Club Fitter of the Year, 2016 GRAA Top 50 Teacher, 2015 LPGA TNCP National Teacher of the Year, 2015 Northern Chapter SCPGA Teacher of the Year, as well as the LPGA TNCP Western Section Teacher of the Year award in 2012, 15, and 17. She was also selected as an LPGA Top 50 Teacher in 2017 and was inducted into the Southern California PGA Teaching Hall of Fame. Dr. Curdt contributes to Golf Tips magazine as a top 30 instructor and has been featured in 7 separate segments on the Golf Channel. Golf Digest selected her as one of America's best young teachers for 2016 through 2017. She currently is the Director of Instruction at Wood Ranch Golf Club and practices as a licensed clinical sports psychotherapist. Dr. Curdt utilizes EMDR to help athletes achieve peak performance and overcome athletic traumas. She serves on the SCPGA Section Board, Northern Chapter SCPGA Board, is a member of the SCPGA Teaching Committee, PGA Adjunct Faculty, Vice President of the LPGA Western Section, and is an LPGA Global Evaluator. An impressive background for sure. So, Dr. Curdt, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thanks so much for all the participants who took time out of their afternoon and evening to learn a little bit about EMDR and golf trauma. There was clearly something about the title or the content that resonates with each of you, so I'm really excited to be able to share my research and also what I do day to day in my private clinical practice and how I help my athletes. I really feel that each of us have, at some level, experienced trauma, and whether it's been on the golf course or in our personal lives. And this technique of EMDR is a fantastic tool to be aware of to help us heal from our past wounds and help us perform better in life, but also perform better on the golf course. Now, the information that I'm going to be sharing this afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone you're in, is to satisfy the requirements for my LPGA Master's thesis. So I did conduct some research. You'll see throughout the outline tonight a little bit of some clinical aspects and some research aspects, and this is just to fulfill the LPGA Master thesis portion. So what we're going to cover in our next 50 minutes or so is learn a little bit about what athletic trauma is and what EMDR stands for and what it really means. Part of the LPGA Master's thesis requires an individual to cover a literature review. And I've broken up my literature review into 3 different segments, beginning with trauma, going next into whether sports psychology is even effective for athletes, and then lastly covering eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. Now, what a literature review is it asks an individual to scan what has been published, academic and peer-reviewed over the past decade in these three different content areas, and then to see how it relates and supports my ideas or refutes my ideas. Then I'll move into how I conducted my case study. So my design for my project was to work with two different golf professionals and apply EMDR to them, and then to look at the different results and benefits that they received. We'll look at the different results that they had and how this will impact their life positively moving forward. We'll be looking at the significance of the study and then finishing up with if there's any limitations of a study and areas for future research. So that's what's going to be our outline for the next hour. So why would I even come up with EMDR and healing golf traumas or athletic traumas? So this is called the background of the problem. Well, through my own personal competition experience and just living life, I know that we've all experienced failure, disappointing losses, heartbreaks, and even traumas. Now, sometimes that occurs on the golf course or in our personal life. And so my own experience with different types of trauma impacting my golf really motivated me to seek different ways to heal from those past wounds. I can recall different shots in my junior career or my collegiate career that still haunt me today, 10, 15 years later. Or I can still remember disappointments that occurred in different tournaments that when I bring back and evoke those memories, still can become emotional about those responses. And so learning to understand what that really means, how that information is processed in my brain, and what different tools I can use to heal from that was the motivation for further study of EMDR and golf traumas. Well, the NCAA does state that nearly all athletes will experience at some point in their career a disappointing loss. And that loss can create anxieties, depression, or as in golf, we might be familiar with the yips, whether it's putting or chipping yips. Different sort of performance issues arise from these disappointing losses that athletes face. And it's not just in golf, but thinking of a pitcher who may not be able to throw the ball to the catcher anymore. Has anyone heard of Rick Ankiel? Was a famous Major League Baseball player who came up with a performance issue from some past trauma and ended up not being able to pitch to the catcher anymore and had to move into the outfield.
Allison,
yes.
I am going to ask you, would you please share your screen again? I can no longer see your PowerPoint. I think that would be helpful. I don't know why that happened. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see if we can get back in here.
Perfect.
All right, can we see it okay?
Yes, now we can see it. Perfect.
All right,
Thank
fantastic.
you.
Thanks for letting me know. So golfers themselves are definitely not immune from experiencing adverse events on the golf course or adverse events in their personal life that impact what happens on the golf course. And a lot of times negative consequences can arise from these adverse events. This can be loss of tournament income, the inability to hit shots that you've practiced hundreds of thousands of times, and ultimately decreasing one's confidence within themselves, and which lowers self-esteem and creates tremendous amount of self-doubt. Well, EMDR has been noted to be an efficacious treatment designed to help alleviate the suffering from traumas. So whether that trauma occurs on the golf course or occurs in your personal life, EMDR has been noted to become an effective treatment modality. Now, what you're going to see throughout this presentation is some names and dates within parentheses, and that is just the citation for where the information has come from. You're going to see quite a bit of this name at the bottom here, Shapiro. And Francine Shapiro is basically the creator of EMDR. In 1989, she was walking in a park in New York and was thinking about some distressing memories. And as she moved her eyes back and forth, she started to realize that the distressing memories became less vivid and more tolerable. So she took that idea and formulated what is now EMDR. So when you see that name Shapiro, you'll know that that is the creator of this psychotherapeutic technique. So as we get into the research, the statement of what the problem is, golfers experience traumas, upsetting events, adverse events on the golf course, and that can interfere with optimal performance, whether that's missing a short putt or hitting a shot into the water. These adverse events and traumas can interfere with performance moving forward. If anyone watched the LPGA Tour this past weekend, you might have seen on the last hole, Carlotta Segunda was really working hard to shoot 62 and had a potential to shoot 61. And then from 110 yards on the 18th hole, shanked a wedge shot to basically a lost ball situation and finished double bogey. That would be an experience of potentially a trauma for her, or at least an adversity that could interfere moving forward with other 110-yard wedge shots going into greens. The sports psychological interventions that are available to us, whether that's mindfulness techniques, neurofeedback, biofeedback, or any cognitive behavioral therapies to help individuals perform better, those really just touch on the cerebral aspects of performance, imagery, visualization, emotional regulation, but it doesn't really get down to the deep core of what has happened to that golfer. So the sports psychological interventions that are available and currently used by mental coaches and sports psychologists, they really miss the mark when it comes to trauma and how trauma impacts the body. So there needs to be a treatment modality available for golfers to help them heal from these past wounds, and EMDR is that solution. Due to how quickly it works and due to how efficiently it works, it really is an optimal psychological tool to help athletes heal. Now, some of the key terms that will help you understand this research a bit, I've pulled out a couple for you. Athletic trauma is not a term that has been coined by anyone else yet. It's a term, athletic trauma and golf trauma, that I've really kind of manifested myself throughout my doctoral dissertation work and throughout my own training in EMDR. And when you see the term athletic trauma, I want you to think of it as that event that occurs during the course of performance that really overwhelms the golfer's ability to cope. And that could be an increase of emotion or so much frustration that you just can't think straight. Sort of that breaking point, if you will, for an individual. Because that individual goes through this athletic trauma, they then have symptomology that can interfere with performance. So it might interfere with putting moving forward after having a really poor putting day that was impactful to somebody. I want you to think of athletic trauma also as subjective to the eye of the beholder. So what may feel traumatic to me may not feel traumatic to you. So, for example, I recently competed in the KPMG last week, and I had a very poor second round. So some people may say from the outside, well, what a great experience that you were able to compete there. But for me, living the experience may feel more traumatic to me than to the average person. So trauma is sort of in the eye of the beholder. Now, a small t trauma is a type of trauma that interferes with someone's normal daily functioning. These can include things like divorce, heartbreak, financial issues, grief, or having that disappointing loss on the golf course, maybe getting looked over for a job in your career or getting fired from a job. And how it interferes with someone's normal daily functioning is it disrupts their natural emotional regulation, and it exceeds their ability to cope. So these are called small t traumas. Now, large T traumas, these are these significant and extraordinary events that we're more prone to hear about when we think about the word trauma, such as natural disasters, violent assaults, maybe getting robbed or having your house burned down. These would be events that could potentially meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress syndrome. So a lot of times when people hear the word trauma, they instantly default to thinking of these extraordinary and significant events, but there's sort of a spectrum of trauma. Trauma could nearly be missing a putt on the last hole to win the U.S. Open. For a golfer, that can be traumatic for them. And EMDR, which stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. This is a 8-phase treatment that rapidly alleviates the distressing memories tied into trauma. And when we have a memory that is stored from a distressing event, it's typically paired with a belief about oneself, maybe I'm unsafe or I'm not good enough. It also stores the feelings that we have in our body at that time, whether that's anxiety or increased heart rate. So when trauma happens to an individual, there's symptoms that are also stored with it, and EMDR is that treatment modality to help alleviate those symptoms. Getting into a little bit more about what this psychotherapeutic tool is, the idea is when a trauma occurs in someone's life, their brain loses the ability to process the information in an adaptive way. So therefore, all the information tied in with the trauma, the beliefs about oneself during the event, the images associated with the event, the feeling in one's body associated with the event, those get encoded in the brain in a maladaptive way. They basically get stuck, if you will. EMDR looks at a 3-pronged approach when looking at the traumatic memory. What has happened to us in the past impacts us in the present and can potentially negatively impact us in the future as well. So missing a putt in my past when I was 10 years old can impact me now as I compete and can also set the stage for negative performance moving forward. So that's the past, present, and the future. There is a variety of uses for EMDR. It is most notably known and created using for post-traumatic stress syndrome. Now, if you know anything about PTSD, most notably war veterans are something that we tend to think about. Events that might have happened during a war, that memory will end up getting stored in their brain, or the memories will get stored in their brain in a maladaptive way, and they can become triggered in their present day life. They may feel anxiety, depression, they might get jumpy at the sound of, let's say, slamming a car door because it sounds similar to a gunshot. So there's a variety of uses in addition to PTSD, such as the reduction of depression symptoms, the reduction of anxiety symptoms, and also EMDR can be used to set a template for future success. Now what that means is an individual may have anxiety about something that is going to come around the corner for them. So maybe a tournament that they have next week. And as they're feeling anxiety about that, EMDR can be used to help set a template for their future success, how they would like to perform moving forward. In order to use EMDR, there has to be an element of what's called bilateral stimulation. Now, that is looking at the brain in a right hemisphere and left hemisphere and activating both sides of the brain. So if you touch the right side of your body and then the left side of your body, that would be a form of bilateral stimulation. When the eyes move back and forth from right to left, that's another example of bilateral stimulation. The last thing you'll see there is what's called a butterfly hug. So if you cross your arms over your chest, your right hand goes to your left shoulder and your left hand goes to your right shoulder, and you tap back and forth, that's another element of bilateral stimulation. That component is instrumental in EMDR, which we're going to learn a little bit more moving forward. So you'll see a video popping up here of some examples of what we might consider golf traumas in our golf culture. Looking at this research, I've had 3 questions that I came up with that have guided this study. Does EMDR reduce anxiety symptoms in golfers? Is EMDR effective in reducing the intensity of a golf trauma in a golfer? And how is EMDR beneficial to golfers who have experienced golf trauma? Now, looking at this video, you're seeing a lot of shots that mean a lot to these players, and they can cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. And depending on how their brain processes that particular situation can make or break performance issues moving forward. If anyone can think back to the Masters several years ago when Jordan Spieth hit a couple of golf balls in the water, and then the year after returns to that same hole and also hits another golf shot in the water. That is a prime example of a traumatic situation happening for a golfer, and a perfect situation for EMDR to be of benefit. Now, in reviewing the research on trauma, there's a couple of golden nuggets, if you will, that I wanted to pull out and share with you so that you have some better background about trauma and how this applies to us as golfers. The research says that exposure to a traumatic event is quite the norm, and that nearly 90% of people in our society will be exposed to at least one severe traumatic event. That would be that large T trauma. But experiencing multiple traumas is actually quite normal for all of us. And you might even experience a couple of traumas in an 18-hole round of golf. But the good news is that the memories of these traumatic events, they're quite malleable, which means that we can work with them. They're not set in stone in our brain. Through different techniques, we can actually change our perspective of how those events felt to us. Some events that maybe impacted us as children or junior golfers may not impact us as much as we are adults. So that's an example of those traumatic events being malleable. The research even states that, being exposed to a traumatic event may not be quite that bad because it can build psychological resilience. Grit is a word that has been used quite a bit from Angela Duckworth in her fantastic book on grit. And there's some components in there that talk about going through adverse events or having hardships can make you stronger. Well, it can also build a resilience to traumas moving forward. So for a young golfer in their early tournament career, going through some of these adversities may feel like a huge shock to them at the beginning, but after 5 or 10 years of playing golf, making a triple bogey may not quite be as traumatic to them, so they can build a psychological resilience. The consequences of experiencing trauma certainly bring up depression issues, anxiety issues, performance issues. Performance issues can be what we know as the yips, or inability to perform a learned motor pattern that we've done thousands of times. We tend to think that athletes are less prone to depression and anxiety. We think they might be stronger and healthier, but there was actually interesting research that stated athletes are at an increased frequency of suffering from depression compared to the general population. So they're actually a population that is quite vulnerable, if you will. Golfers are faced with a multitude of different adverse events in the course of 4.5 hours competing on the golf course. And so they are more prone to suffering from depression and anxiety compared to the general population. There has been some research that has linked traumatic experiences in one's past to anxiety-based disorders such as the yips. Now, looking at the sports psychology research, is sports psychology even efficient for anybody? We've got mental coaches that are becoming more prominent in our society, in the golf culture. I feel that we are talking more about individuals going to golf psychologists or sports psychologists. We certainly have some fantastic, well-known mental coaches that are doing great things out there and helping lots of athletes. Well, what's great about that is that there's a growing acceptance of sports psychological services amongst athletes and sports programs. However, the downside is that receptivity is really only specific to performance issues. In fact, in one recent study, receptivity amongst golf coaches is very, very high when looking at emotional regulation, confidence levels, imagery and visualization, things that are going to help an athlete perform better on a cerebral level. But the moment those golf coaches were made aware of working with an individual's personal issues, the receptivity among sports psychological work was decreased, which I find that very, very interesting. So the minute we start talking about how our personal lives impact our playing lives, receptivity goes down. Sports psychological interventions are effective for things such as recovering from an injury, coping from disappointments, having negative images that permeate our brain before performance, and things such as the yips or other performance issues, negative self-statements. Those interventions are very effective. Some of the psychological problems that golfers may face, we know that there's a huge psychological component to golf because there's so much downtime in between shots. In fact, if an individual scores in the mid-80s and plays golf in about 4.5 hours, there's typically about 30 to 40 minutes of actual physical motion being made, and the rest of that time, about 3.5 hours, is spent just being with oneself. And so a lot of times negative self-talk can start to come up, decreases in confidence can arise, anxiety, lack of focus, depression symptoms. Yips is very, very talked about in our golf culture, and performance blocks. The possible interventions in the sports psychology research that were discovered include mindfulness, which is gaining a lot of ground. In fact, I recently saw an ad that came through my email about mindfulness for golf. There's a current program out there that someone is promoting mindfulness for golf. There's neurofeedback. We know that focus band has been gaining quite some ground for the masses. Individuals are learning how their brain is functioning while they're trying to compete and getting into the best hemisphere that allows them to perform their best. Biofeedback has gained some ground, learning about heart rate and breathing and how to be able to control that to perform one's best. And sport hypnotherapy has also gained some ground. So being able to get into sort of a trance-like state which allows someone to be very receptive to positive ideas. There's also quite a bit of research on EFT, which stands for emotional focused therapy, and lastly, several studies on EMDR in sports psychology. Now, lastly, looking at the EMDR research. If you're still a little bit curious about how EMDR actually works, what you would do is you would see a therapist sit across from an athlete about 1 or 2 feet, and then the therapist would hold up their hand and the athlete would gaze at their fingers. The therapist would move their hand back and forth so that the athlete's eyes follow and track their fingers. So that eye movement that moves horizontally left and right resembles the same eye movements that occur in REM sleep. So when you go to sleep and you get into that REM stage, if you've ever watched somebody in the stage with their eyes closed, you'll see their eyes move back and forth. You'll know that they're at REM sleep at this time. What occurs during that stage is that information from the day ends up becoming processed from short-term memory to long-term memory. So the brain decides what information is important to us and what's going to help us survive and learn and move forward productively, and it's going to store that in long-term memory. And then there's going to be other stuff that has happened throughout our day that we deem not relevant that the brain's just going to discard. So in a waking state, when a therapist moves an athlete's eyes back and forth, they're basically recreating that REM sort of movement from the eyes and is taking that information and consolidating it into long-term memory. However, as we already mentioned, when a traumatic event occurs in one's life, it might be too big, too large for that athlete to cope with. Therefore, that memory does not get consolidated into long-term memory, and it becomes stuck. And when it becomes stuck, it then is open to becoming triggered. Now, being triggered means that when you get into an environment that is like or similar to the trauma that you experienced, your body can't decide what's going on, and it will relive that trauma. So, for example, as we talked about Carlotta Saganda on the 18th hole yesterday, hitting that 110-yard shot, shanking it to the right, if that memory did not get stored last night when she went to bed appropriately and it became stuck, then when she gets into a like or similar situation, potentially going for a career low 61, or being on the 18th hole, or being from 110 yards, or actually having a wedge in her hand, those situations can trigger the trauma that she experienced. Now, the eye movements that occur during EMDR are suggested to decrease the vividness of the images associated with a trauma. So if you think back to a trauma that you have kept with you, you'll always be able to decide that there's one part that seems the most painful or the most vivid, the most traumatic to you. The eye movements, when they are occurring back and forth, taxes what's called working memory, and it makes the vividness of those images decrease so that the trauma is more tolerable to deal with. You might even experience this freshly after experiencing a disappointment. The images are like very fresh in your mind and they may be very painful, but then a couple of weeks later you might think back to that incident that you went through and it hurts less. This is kind of an example of what this means. Now, EMDR has already been documented and researched in peer-reviewed articles in 3 different instances with success. They've been used in different ways, and they've all been case study methods, but there have been 3 instances already published in the past 2 years with success with golfers. The research also indicates that eye movements are far superior than any other form of bilateral stimulation, but sometimes individuals and clients can't handle the eye movements. It may create too much discomfort for them. So there are alternatives, such as the butterfly hug, as I mentioned, or tapping. Now, some of you may have seen my Tapping Into Your Best Golf presentation at the PGA show earlier this year, and also at the PGA show in Vegas coming up in August, where I'll be talking about using tapping your right and left knee or tapping your shoulders can help decrease the vividness of the traumatic memories that you might have. Now, going into my particular research for the master's thesis process, I used a case study methodology, which means looking at an individual in depth, applying a treatment to them, and then recording sort of before treatment information and after treatment information. And so in my particular research, I decided to use 2 professional golfers who were able to identify a golf trauma in their life that they thought might be causing some performance issues for them. EMDR was administered to them, and they also took a couple of measurements so that we could record and document what their process was like. So I'm going to walk through the different measurements that were used. In order to be applicable for the study and be a suitable subject, the participant had to pass what's called the dissociative experiences scale. We all disassociate at some level. In fact, if any of you have kids, they're watching TV and you've just fixed a nice dinner and you call their name, Johnny, hey, it's dinner, Johnny, dinner time, and they don't hear you at all, and finally they snap out of it and they're like, oh, sorry, Mom, I didn't hear you. That would be a dissociative experience. Or you might be driving your car on a very familiar route and you end up at your destination and you're like, wow, I don't even really remember driving all the way here. That's a dissociative experience. And so in order for these 2 professional golfers to be suitable subjects, they had to make sure that they didn't disassociate to relieve themselves from the pain of their trauma. So both of the professional golfers did pass that scale, and they were deemed suitable subjects. Then I measured their anxiety using the competitive state anxiety inventory. 3 different types of anxiety were measured, and they were measured in a quiet time throughout their day, just a normal, maybe before bedtime or right when they woke up. And then anxiety was measured right before they went out onto the golf course, whether they were in competition or they were going to go play 9 holes. The 3 types of anxiety that were measured was what's called cognitive state anxiety, and that means the sort of worrying that occurs in your brain. The second anxiety was somatic state anxiety. That's the anxiety you feel in your body, more of the jittery uncomfortableness. And the last form of anxiety is actually the opposite of anxiety, and that's self-confidence. It tends to be the opposite of cognitive anxiety. So if someone doesn't worry all that much and they feel really confident in themselves, I wanted to measure that before treatment and after treatment. Now, in EMDR, there's always what's called a subjective units of distress scale, and this helps identify how upsetting the memory is to the participant, how intense that golf trauma feels to them. 10 is the most distressing that an individual can feel, and 1 is hardly no distress at all. Next, there is a validity of cognition. This basically means one's strength and their belief about themselves. So they might say, I feel that I am good enough. We'd want to measure that. 7 means that that's a very true statement. 1 means that's not so true to them. And lastly, I did a follow-up interview, which is called a social validation questionnaire, to learn about how their experience through EMDR was beneficial and what sort of predictions they might have in their performance moving forward. So for the 2 participants, participant A and participant B, I gave you a little bit of background information here. I want to make a note to let you know that identifying information has been altered and removed in order to preserve these participants' confidentiality. Participant A was a professional player, female, and had over 30 years of competitive experience, whether that was a combination of junior golf, collegiate golf, and LPGA Tour experience. The performance issue identified was certainly anxiety, and there were some feelings that came up for her that included shame, isolation, self-doubt, and embarrassment. She was able to locate one of several golf traumas from her childhood that included missing putts in front of some junior teammates, along with other multiple memories of other missed putts from similar distances. Participant B, on the other hand, is a little bit younger, and she had over a decade of playing experience, but still at the professional level. Her performance issue identified was also anxiety, and there was quite a bit of feelings of self-doubt and not feeling worthy of deserving any good in her play. She was able to very specifically target a golf trauma that occurred a couple of years ago for her, where she narrowly missed being in a specific money leader category in order to earn exemption on the tour that she was attempting to play. Now, looking at the data results here, this is actually pretty easy to understand because I'm going to break it down for us. We talked about these 3 types of anxiety. So the cognitive anxiety, that's that worrying. Somatic anxiety, that's what we feel in the body. And then the self-confidence, that's the opposite of worry, and that's going to be how great we feel in ourselves. So for participant A, the professional player who had over 30 years of experience, she again took this assessment during a quiet time in her day and then right before performing. The pink box is prior to any EMDR treatment, and the blue box is after we completed the EMDR treatment. Now, her ratings for cognitive state anxiety were 20 and 27. The closer one gets to 36, the higher the anxiety. The closer one gets to 9, the lower the anxiety. So most of us will always operate on some form of anxiety. It's quite normal for us, but 20 and 27 are in the moderate to high ranges. The somatic anxiety that she felt in her body were in the moderate range at 14 and 15. And then confidence was quite a bit lower during a quiet time in her life, and it gained up a little bit before performance. Now, after EMDR, we have significant results here. So if we go down to the blue box right underneath that under participant A, you're going to see that cognitive state anxiety went down significantly. So the worrying that she experienced in her mind that she documented before treatment at 20 and 27 went down to scores of 13 and 12, which is going to be on our low range. So again, operating at about a 9 or 10 is pretty much the normal for the general population. The anxiety that was felt in the body also decreased, went down to a score of 12 in both cases, and self-confidence skyrocketed. So during a quiet time in her day, she nearly maxed out at 32. 36 is the highest one can score in self-confidence. That means that very much so they feel confident in everything that they're doing. Well, prior to performing, this individual noted that she was at a 36, so that's quite significant. Now, participant B, this is our tour player of 10 years, who narrowly missed getting a money leader status. He had moderate anxiety and cognitive state during a quiet time and then right before performing at 21 and 25, and definitely quite a bit higher in the body in the somatic state anxiety at 19 and 21. And confidence was right in the middle here at 19 and 19. Now, after treatment, she had decreases pretty much in everything for anxiety. So the cognitive state anxiety, that worrying, went down to 17 and 16. The anxiety that she felt in her body started to decrease at 12 and 11. Confidence in her day-to-day living went up to 23, and confidence right before performing stayed right about the same. Now, participant A, our 30-year veteran here, she rated the impact of her memory of missing short putts in front of junior teammates and other short putts that she could recall. She rated that event on the impact of event scale of a 28. Now, to give you a little bit of frame of reference, if an individual scores between 24 and 33, these are clinical concerns for post-traumatic stress syndrome, which means that there is going to be some symptomology that would be diagnosable if an individual is above 24. So thinking back to this event in her junior career was quite significant at 28. She rated that the memory was distressing at maxing out of a score of 10. So the most distress that she could potentially feel, this memory came up for her. The belief that she identified was this feeling of belonging, and it didn't feel very true. She didn't feel like she belonged with that memory. She didn't belong with her teammates and didn't feel like she belonged in the space that she was at. Now, after treatment, the impact of the event went all the way down to a 0. So when she recalled the memory, it had no impact on her whatsoever beside a scene that just passed through her eyes, something that occurred in her life that she was able to overcome. She felt 0 distress about the memory. Nothing about the memory created any sort of discomfort in her memory whatsoever. And then her belief about belonging, I do belong, I belong in groups, it went all the way up to a 7. She felt truly validated that she belonged in groups. Now this is quite significant because this all occurred in the course of one EMDR session. So this memory that she had been holding on to for decades was able to be healed in the course of one EMDR session. Looking at participant B, she rated that impact of the event, narrowly missing that money leader status, of a score of 22. And again, if you remember, 24 or more is of clinical concern, so very, very close to experiencing some symptomology of at least partial PTSD. She identified the distress of that memory at a 7, 10 being the highest, so still pretty high. The belief that she identified was, I didn't do my best. And so when she thought about the belief of, I did do my best, it was rated pretty low as a 4. After EMDR, the impact of the event was rated at a 7. So it went down significantly, and it created 0 distress for her when she recalled the image in her mind. When she asked herself whether she did do her best during that particular year, she felt very validated and was able to score a level of 7. So this too was also a 4 or 5 year trauma that this individual held in her heart and soul, and within one EMDR session was able to have quite a bit of relief from the pain that she had been harnessing. So what does this really mean? We go back to our 3 research questions that have guided the study. Does EMDR reduce anxiety symptoms derived from golf traumas in golfers? Well, in our 2 case studies, yes, absolutely. Anxiety went down for both of those participants. Is EMDR effective in reducing the intensity of golf traumas? And we see in our data results, yes. In both cases, the images that those golfers held in their mind for many, many years decreased intensely. And how is EMDR beneficial to those golfers that have experienced golf traumas? Well, clearly we saw a decrease in symptomology, so the anxiety went down, the vividness and discomfort of the image also decreased. Confidence improved, and we all know that confidence is a huge factor when it comes to golf performance. Some golf tournaments have been won with lesser skill levels but increased confidence. For these individuals, they had less self-doubt about their ability to perform, which therefore greatly impacted motivation to whether pursue other goals in golf, to go into different tournaments, and to continue to practice and fine-tune their skills. And lastly, there was both feelings of emotional lightness. So this emotional burden that had been carried by both of these individuals was certainly relinquished after their treatment with EMDR. Now, in any research study, there's always limitations. And so when looking at a case study, we're looking in depth into an individual's life. So we get a very limited viewpoint and a very limited perspective of what's occurred because we are looking at only 2 people. You'll notice that both of my participants were female. So limitation might be, what gender differences are there? Does trauma impact a male professional golfer different than a female professional golfer? And scanning back, does trauma impact males differently than females? What gender differences might there be? Another limitation is cultural differences. So we look at the domination of Asian cultures on the LPGA Tour, and as they experience adversity and hardship, I'm curious to know whether they experience golf trauma and adversity differently than American players or European players. So there could be some great research on the cultural differences for how professional golfers or golfers in general experience trauma. We looked at 2 elite players, top cream of the crop, but does trauma impact beginners differently? Because they have less of a reservoir of experiences, does missing a 3-foot putt impact them differently than someone who's been playing for 10 years and who's a single-digit handicap? That'd be another interesting limitation to look at. In any research, we also want to inquire about what future research we might do and what implications for our golf culture and for us as golf professionals this might implicate. So certainly as golf professionals, we cannot use EMDR unless you are a licensed therapist. You have to have a license by your state in order to use the treatment on somebody else. However, if you're made aware of EMDR and Gulf traumas, you might be able to help your clients and your students get in front of the right professional to help them heal. You might also have a greater understanding of what your students go through because you understand Gulf traumas and EMDR. There's certainly an ability to heal quickly from emotional experiences. So as we look at maybe a tour player's life, they play Thursday through Sunday, they've got 3 days to practice and get to a new site, and then they're already competing again. So if something happens on Sunday afternoon and they're around, EMDR would be a fantastic modality to be used immediately after the trauma so that they can go into their next tournament performing at their best. Because we are all prone to having some sort of adverse event occur in our life or to have some sort of trauma, this is a great tool to be used across the masses, all cultures and all genders. If we can prevent trauma from impacting the individual for extended periods of time, then we can certainly take away years and decades of distressing emotions and hardships. So the quick and efficient way that EMDR works is really helpful to prevent having someone experience trauma for a long period of time. For future research, quantitative research designs are certainly significantly stronger, and that might be an area for other future researchers to look through as we experience more EMDR in our Gulf culture. So I want to thank you so much for sitting through this presentation. Hopefully this has opened your eyes a little bit about some other possibilities in the sport psychology world for how you can help your students. You might also resonate with some of the experiences and examples that I provided in the presentation that hit your heart. You might have carried traumas with you for multiple years, and maybe that's impacted your golf in a negative way. So it certainly might be a great tool for you yourself to experience to clear out some of that trauma for yourself. So at this time, would love to field any questions that might have come in during the presentation. You'll notice that on this last slide, I also put up my contact information. So if your question doesn't get in, feel free to email me at allison@pga.com. And you can certainly visit both of my websites that talk about how I use EMDR as a golf professional and also as a sports psychotherapist.
Awesome. Okay, so we have 2 or 3 questions here. So the first one was, how did you determine that sports psychology techniques are ineffective? What is the specific evidence indicating that they are ineffective?
So am I hearing you say ineffective or effective?
Ineffective.
Okay, so the sports psychology research indicates that interventions are effective, not ineffective.
Maybe they meant something else. So let's go to the next question. So
Sure.
Does hypnosis qualify as an example of EMDR?
No, absolutely not. Hypnosis is a completely different therapeutic modality. So EMDR is its own separate tool, if you will. You might have heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. So those are all different types of therapy that can be used. Hypnosis is not really a clinical therapy. It's used more to change state. You certainly, if you want to use hypnosis, should go to someone that is certified in hypnosis, but they may not be a licensed clinician. So EMDR is completely separate than hypnosis, 2 completely different principles.
Perfect. So how many therapists are actually trained in EMDR?
There are thousands worldwide. This is a therapeutic modality that is worldwide. It's used in lots of different countries. The best place to find an EMDR trained therapist near you is to go to the website that lists all therapists that are trained, and that is www.emdria.com. And then you'll see a link that says Find a Therapist, and you'll be able to type in your zip code and see who is near you. So that's the best way, but there's thousands of therapists that are trained in EMDR.
Did you use an alternative method / treatment to compare as an active control group or as a within group comparison? Otherwise, the effects of using the EMDR could be due simply to the placebo effect.
No, absolutely not. So in case studies in EMDR, there's a precedent that is set in the research, and that research design is not used for this type of work. So for these case studies, usually there is some sort of measurement, whether it's anxiety or some sort of putting performance. The list goes on and on for what has already been published. And so in this particular study, you could certainly get as many variables as you want moving about, but the variables of anxiety are what I selected, as well as the intensity of the distressing memory. And that's pretty typical for a case study design.
Where could one learn about tapping?
There's a great book by Dr. Laura Parnell, and it's called Tapping In. She's an EMDR trained therapist, and she focuses in mainly attachment type EMDR. And so her book, Tapping In, goes through several different scripts of how an individual can use positive self-statements with positive imagery and to tap those into one's resource that you can use moving forward. So I would definitely recommend that book, Tapping In.
So we have a comment here that said that she recently did some EMDR work when her father died for grief, and she never thought about using it in this way, and she said it was a great presentation. Also, going back to the first question that I asked, ineffective, she said earlier in her presentation on the third slide or so that sport psych was ineffective. So I was glad that she corrected that statement because there's a lot of research saying that it is effective. So.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me go back to that slide real quick. And if we look at the third point down, sports psychology interventions are effective. And if you look at the 2012 research article, those are going to be the pieces that have been studied for what sports psychology interventions are effective for.
Great, great, great. So I don't see any other questions at the moment. A lot of good jobs and great presentations, so very proud. You should be very proud of yourself. Thank you so much for taking the time for this presentation. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much, and thanks again to all the participants who took their time to be a part of it and ask questions. And again, if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to keep reaching out. If anyone's going to be at the PGA show in August and want to learn a little bit more about tapping, I will be doing a presentation during the educational conference, so feel free to come to that to continue to learn more.
Perfect. And for everyone who was in attendance, I will be sending out the post-webinar survey, and you should be seeing that sometime tomorrow. So thank you all again for taking the time out of your day, and thank you again, Allison.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Bye.